My name is Jonathan Casey. This is the Classical Liberal Project. Joined by Mike Tremont. You're running for the Libertarian Party nomination for president. Thank you for joining. You kind of suggested this. You kind of suggested this a few months ago, and I think it's a good idea for people to kind of sit down and actually talk about these things. Too often we're sitting behind a screen, we're talking behind a screen, so it's good to actually get in front of somebody and actually talk to somebody face to face.
I agree 100%. And you and I have spoken directly before, but not in person like this.
No.
This is a good thing for me personally. Thank you for doing it.
Absolutely. Well, we met in Reno.
That's right.
And then we've had a few conversations since then. You've jumped in on a few COC members meetings, and that's always good. People always like to do that because then they can ask you questions directly. And
your meetings can be kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, we have a lot of great
Some
discussions.
have been more interesting than others.
This is very true. As long as I try to steer things away from internal drama, but that always tends back. But it's nice when a candidate for president comes in and talks, because then people can focus on the things that really matter. And frankly, what really matters is making sure we have candidates on the ballot and that are that they're speaking to the general population, because we love discussing things. We love debating things, and sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we're really here to speak to the general population and say, hey, here's a message, here's a vision for the country.
Well, I agree, and of course that's the whole nature of our campaign. It's designed to be very productive on the other side of the nomination, both in terms of messaging and the professionalism with which we've built the team, the professionalism with which we plan on delivering that message. So we believe it has to be done with a tremendous amount of credibility and qualifications.
I think that's pretty important. Anybody who's heard me talk about the Libertarian Party knows that I start with professionalism first. I think that's a very we're held to a different standard than Republicans and Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't try to hold ourselves to a better standard than them, then people are going to judge us quite harshly.
Sure.
and aren't going to take us seriously.
Well, I agree with you, and I furthermore think that it's hyper important this cycle, because we need to lead with a very principled platform to differentiate ourselves from the Republicans and the Democrats more than ever before. It's my view, as you know, that we haven't done a very good job of that in the past. And so when running a very principled platform, as you know, we're running on what we call the Gold New Deal, which is a collection of the most transformational ideas. When you're running a platform like that, you've got to be able to back it up with a lot of credibility. You can't just, as I often say, stand on the balcony and scream, "End the Fed," and expect to be taken completely seriously.
So, for those who don't know, can you explain the New Deal? The Gold New Deal? What does that mean? What can people say when they see you talk about it? What does that mean?
It means reimagining the relationship between us and our government, between us and the federal government, between us and state governments, and importantly, between state governments and the federal government. So the flagship, and people can read about the details all they want, and probably more than they want, at goldnewdeal.org. The flagship is the idea of ending federal supremacy, giving the states an option to opt out of federal supremacy, to resolve conflicts between state law and federal law in state courts, leading to unilateral nullification, as a matter of decentralization, as a matter of allowing states to chart their own political courses. What we're trying to do here is head off what I believe would be eventually the alternative, which is for the drumbeat of secession to continue to build, which I think we all understand. As much as we all might be skeptical of what secession could and would achieve, I don't think anyone can actually say you haven't thought about it.
Right, for sure.
You
I'm a Texan. We've always thought about it.
We've always thought about it, right? Having grown up in Illinois, I can tell you that anyone who has made that drive between Chicago and Springfield as many times as I have knows that those are two different worlds.
Yeah.
And so if, for example, Illinois, and most states are like this, if your state were to secede, you still wouldn't resolve the conflicts that are inside of your state. And of course, what most people want to do is see their crazy neighbors secede, not themselves. Most people don't want to live in a place other than the United States of America. So anyway, that's one big piece of it. But the other pieces are important elements of changing the relationship between us and the government. For example, I'm a big believer that the idea that there should be a direct financial relationship through the IRS, that individuals should be taxed to support the federal government, I think that that's wholly inappropriate. I recognize that there is a constitutional amendment backing that up, and it would be nice to reverse that. But I do believe that states ought to be standing up for us. Federal government should have to go to state legislatures for any revenue. Now, as libertarians, we all believe that the amount of revenue should be a hell of a lot smaller.
Right.
I think you could build a better case that it should be zero than you can a case that it should be what it is today.
For sure.
Right? But anyone who's ever been audited by the IRS, as I have, I'm sure you have too. I'm just looking at you. You're someone I would audit.
I'm a business owner, and I know that's coming. I know that someday I will be audited.
I would audit you if I were the IRS. I had to pick someone. Just looking at you, some libertarian small business owner, absolutely. Yes. You'd be in my crosshairs. Anyone who's ever been, call me when it happens. Yeah. Anyone who's ever been audited knows that is an imbalanced relationship. You are in a world of hurt. Yeah. And in my case, as it turns out, as I had always believed, I was right about what I was doing. They accused me of doing something wrong. They had made a mistake. And it meant outwaiting them for 2 years. Just, it's a pain in the neck. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an inappropriate relationship. I think that ought to be handled between the state. I would have preferred if the state of Florida had stood up for me.
Right.
But it couldn't. And so it was very annoying. And I just think that we need a different style of relationship there. It also means pulling back on the power of the federal government in a host of other ways.
That's kind of where it has to start, right? It has to start by reducing the size of how much you're paying for before you can really deal with some of the other issues. So if I understand it correctly, you would remove the federal government's ability to tax individuals, and you put that they would have to go to the states for funding.
Absolutely.
Okay. If
you can convince the state legislature to hand over money, because I know states are as cheap as you and I are. Then,
Well, sure. Then they're incentivized to reduce how much they're sending over, and I think that definitely, and it also helps kind of rebalance things, because you're right. When the IRS goes after somebody, when any government agency goes after somebody, they are backed by $1 trillion organization.
With its own courts.
With its own courts, it's all
presuming you to be guilty at the onset.
Right. Well, you get me started on something. You want to get me started on on the presumption of guilt when you deal with a few different systems, with the tax systems.
Yes.
And there's a few other areas where it's just like you have to prove not qualified immunity, civil asset forfeiture, where you have to go in and you have to prove that your property wasn't used in a crime, and
which is bizarre to begin with, because there's no reason a police agency or any other agency should have the right to take your assets to begin with.
Right.
Much less under the presumption that they're right and you're wrong.
Right. Exactly.
No, it's insane.
Okay, so I like that. That's a great.
Even your right to carry, by the way.
Right.
I can tell you as a police officer, if you're found to be carrying, an officer is going to ask.
Right.
Well, unless you're in certain states, right? Where's your permit? Well,
yeah,
you and I see how bass backwards that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I like the term that's kind of come about in the kind of the YIMBY movement, where it's development by right, where the government has to prove that you shouldn't be allowed to develop your property.
That's right.
And I think that could be applied to a lot of things. Like your government shouldn't, you should like concealed carry or any kind of carry. The government should be the one that has to prove that you shouldn't be doing those things.
That's right.
Immigration. Government should have to prove that you shouldn't be immigrating. Many other areas where that can be applied, and I think that you're right. Agreed. It kind of goes back to this, you're guilty by default setting that we've kind of gotten to in this country. If we can, everything should be, government has to prove that you shouldn't be allowed to do something.
It's a weird place that we're in. I attribute it to something fairly fundamental. I think that the people who work for government, by and large, are in what I would call a political class that has values that are different from everybody else's, from not only yours and mine, but from most Americans. And I think that that's what this election is really going to be about. It's about that schism in terms of values. I don't think the election is going to be about small things. For example, I don't think it's going to be about, should the retirement age for full Social Security benefits be 68 and a half or 68 and 3/4. I think it's more going to be about who's got the guts to stand up and say, recruiting young people into a pyramid scheme for the reason to, take care of the overhang from having so many elderly in the system already. That's unethical. That's evil. Right. That's evil stuff. That's a schism in values. That's not an argument we should be having over a calculator.
Right.
if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Just as an example. And I think that that is the schism in terms of culture that is arriving now, that I think will be much more important than the schism in culture that we have between right and left, over wokeism, for example.
For sure.
I'm optimistic that some of that culture war is dissipating a little bit, and we'll get to something that I think is actually more important in the long run.
Well, sure. For a long time at the beginning, Social Security was propped up by high birth rates. And as the birth rates go down, well, the fewer amount of people are able to pay into the system. So it's coming to a reckoning. Everyone sees it. No one's willing to deal with it. So let's get to, you talked about messaging, kind of your perception of messaging. Do you think that it is your job to, there always seems to be a struggle between putting out messaging of practical, okay, here's some practical steps you can, to reduce Social Security or slowly step it out. Or here's the alternative is end Social Security tomorrow, done with it. Where do you find that balance? Is there a balance? Are you on one side or the other? Or do you think that, or how do you...
The right message is a hell of a lot closer to B than A.
Okay.
Without the tomorrow piece.
Okay.
No, I don't think that's an argument for a calculator, as I mentioned. I do believe that we have to make the argument that Social Security is a bad idea altogether and it has to be sunset, lock, stock, and barrel. Having said that, it can't be done tomorrow because you've got people in the system.
Right.
I don't think we should be positioning ourselves as so unethical that we would pull the rug out from under people who have already paid in.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So there has to be an exit ramp for the system. I also believe that there have to be exit options for people who are already in the system.
Right.
By the way, politically as well, I don't think the nation is quite ready for the idea that people who are in the system are going to be thrown out.
Right.
So you need options for exit ramps, and then you got to terminate the idea of bringing more people in.
Right.
So that it has to be resolved completely. But I think that your question goes to something even larger, which is to say, is the right messaging how we really feel, or should we be in the business of making ourselves more palatable to the American people?
Absolutely.
If I can read between the lines.
Absolutely. No, that's exactly where I was going.
And I honestly believe that we have a bit of a false dichotomy going on being debated inside of our party. I believe that it is not up to our libertarian candidate, our national campaign, our presidential element, to try to find common ground with Republican or Democratic politicians. Find common ground with their voters, yes.
Absolutely.
But it's our job to completely differentiate from Republican candidates, from Democratic candidates. Indeed, to cleave a hard edge against each one of those. And to leave it unmistakable that we present a completely different choice. By contrast, if your slogan is, as it was in 2016, if your slogan is, I'm fiscally conservative like a Republican and socially liberal like a Democrat, not only do I think you failed Marketing 101 in terms of defining yourself in the context of your competitors, but you haven't given anyone a reason to hang on to your campaign. You haven't presented yourself as a completely different choice. Indeed, one might argue that you've given people either one way or another not to like you.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
I would also argue that you're lying to people. We are not fiscally conservative like Republicans. We're actually fiscally conservative.
Right.
We're not socially liberal like Democrats. We're actually socially liberal. We don't beat each other into thinking all the same way, the way Democrats do. We argue about it, and then we punch each other in the face, and then we go have a beer.
Right.
That's the American way.
Absolutely.
And that is, I believe, if you join the Democratic Party out of some sense of your socially liberal rights to feel any way you want, to live your life by your own standards, to say anything you want without being censored, I think you and your party have gone in two different directions.
Yeah.
And so I think, having said all of that, the right play here strategically, even tactically, is to speak our minds in a full-throated fashion, in a way that completely differentiates us, but that leads with principles and that leads with quite transformational ideas. I think that most Americans have a libertarian streak. I don't think they would call it that.
Right.
most Americans can't spell libertarianism.
Right.
Having run for Congress in Florida a couple of years ago, I can tell you that you spend half your time explaining what libertarianism is. Yeah. That there is a Libertarian Party.
Right. Been there many times.
I know you have. And, what it comes down to is that the value of the Libertarian Party brand is approximately zero. There are those who say that in some places the value of the brand is negative, that you would get more votes running as an independent than you would as a libertarian because people don't understand what the party stands for. So I think it's up to us to find that common ground, and I think that more Americans than ever before are open to our style of messaging. More Americans than ever before are frustrated with the Republican and Democratic parties.
Right.
And for cause.
Yeah. I don't blame them. I'm there.
Their leadership is crappy, right? Whichever side you look at. Mm-hmm. Their messaging. They each have left behind what used to be their agenda. We just spoke about social liberalism, about fiscal conservatism, but even free trade. The Republican Party doesn't even stand up.
No.
Protecting you from censorship. Neither party really stands up in any way. And let's not get each other started on the COVID regime.
Right.
I don't think most Americans align with most of what was done.
No.
The dishonesty, the lack of being forthcoming, the economic shutdowns, the vaccine mandates. Most Americans' values align with ours. Yeah. And I don't think it helps us to try to water it down. No. I don't think that it would help us both in terms of spreading the message as far and wide as possible. But it certainly wouldn't help us for those candidates out there who are going to run for Congress in the future or for the school board or anything else. The reason that the Libertarian Party brand is not worth very much is because, in part, we have not done a very good job in our national campaigns of leading the charge in that messaging. We have to be very clear about it. Win, lose, or draw, but I do believe that is the path to victory.
So you would I've asked this of others, and forgive me if I've asked this of you. When you look at the history of libertarian candidates, is there a candidate that stands out to you that say, I would like to emulate his style of campaign? And then what about the opposite? I won't ask you to name anybody, but can you define something about a campaign that you would say, I want to avoid doing that? What would you emulate and what would you not? What would you avoid?
I mean, we're all fans of Harry Brown. We're all fans of Ron Paul, obviously, who was not a Libertarian Party presidential candidate.
88 was.
Yes.
A long time ago. But the 2000s and
but where we all fell in love, of course, was in closer to my time, was when he was actually registered as a Republican, which is an interesting and strange thing, and probably a lesson for us, those of us who think that it can only come from our party.
Fair enough, yeah.
So we do all appreciate when the principled campaign is run. I do believe that there's an even more important lesson to the back half of your question, which is campaigns that have frustrated us in the past. I believe that you've got to combine the two elements of which we've already spoken. One is the professionalism, the credibility, and running a candidate with qualifications, because the American people have a sort of a threshold that you need to clear for them to take you seriously. Which I think, as much as inside the Libertarian Party, we don't put a lot of stock into most of what the American people consider qualifications.
For sure.
Even I personally don't. Ironically, perhaps. But the American people recognize that the reason they're paying attention to the race at all is to see who's going to become president of the United States. Yeah. If you're not in the competition, then you might as well be running your campaign in an odd number year. Why are you running in 2024 instead of 2025 or 2023 if it's not actually to participate in the presidential race? Right. So you have to be competitive. You have to clear a certain threshold for the American people to pay attention. They have to at least be able to imagine imagine that person could theoretically disrupt the duopoly,
Right.
interrupt the way American politics is run, and go all the way.
Yeah.
Or at least mess up the process along the way.
Right.
That's what victory looks like. And we are playing to win.
There you go.
We have to play to win, in my view. And it's important to convey that so that you are taken seriously. But the other element of that is, as we discussed, running a platform that's completely principled. And so in that sense, I would say the most recent campaigns have really let us down. And no, I don't mean that personally. Lovely people. People I admire, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I think that better advice would be to run as edgy a campaign as you could muster at the time. I think we all feel like hindsight's 20/20.
Sure.
I recognize that.
Sure. And you know better than anyone that running a presidential campaign, you have to make a lot of decisions, and you're going to make good ones and bad ones.
You are going to make good ones and bad ones. And having grown up a Republican, having watched my boss's boss say, read my lips, no new taxes, and then go back on it, I know all about bad decisions and the frustrations that you leave in your wake when you make bad decisions. But having said that, I think better advice would have suggested we not miss the opportunity of what was going on during the COVID pandemic. I think we all recognize in hindsight, but in fairness, I think most of us recognized it as it was ongoing, that there was an opportunity that we could have taken advantage of a little bit more robustly than we actually did. So that's a source of frustration.
Yeah. You mentioned qualifications. What qualifies you? What would say to the American people, hey, this is somebody I can vote for, I can trust?
I've been around the block, and a couple of different blocks. And the blocks I've been around have revolved around public policy. I grew up fiscally conservative. I was in commercial finance. When I went back to graduate school in economics, I was lucky to be in a conservative pro-market program, a program that we called Rational Expectations. It was a descendant of the Austrian school, of course. And that has served me well for a number of reasons. I went back into the banking industry as an advocate for free markets and for greater competition. A lot of folks don't remember that in those days, the banking industry was all about greater competition and moving into new markets. So I had a very fun career in public policy. I worked for the White House for a couple of years as an economist in the budget function. I worked for a couple of other international agencies in the banking industry for a long time. I had my own business, educating financial services executives and providing strategic consulting. So I've been around the public policy that surrounds economics and finance for more than a couple of decades. Been around the Federal Reserve System a lot. My research was publicly cited by the Fed chairman. I've met with the Fed board itself in the Fed boardroom. We learn to dislike each other from time to time, and that's not to say that I don't have every respect for their efforts, right? Some of the most talented and hardworking people in the world work for the Fed, but over the last 100 years, they have unfortunately proven that they just can't live up to the mandate that we expect of them. As a second career, I became a police officer. About 13 years ago, I worked as a cop for 11 and a half years on the road in Broward County until about 2 years ago when I ran for Congress as a libertarian. I was a registered libertarian for the entire time that I was a police officer, and then relocated to Virginia and launched this campaign. So I've been around public policy a great deal. I've been around public service.
I was going to say, you've been around the public policy and you've been around the implementation of public policy, which is probably just as important, to see the actual fruits of what policies...
And just as annoying and just as disappointing and just as frustrating.
I'm sure.
And just as debilitating in some ways to your psyche. Most cops have a weird libertarian streak. I think that comes from, as much as anything, the idea that we all love to hate our boss. And if you're a civil servant, that comes in the form of, in my case, can you believe the stupid thing that the legislature did in Tallahassee last week? or the dumb thing that the mayor wants us to do this week, right? And there's always a frustration there. And I think that police officers recognize that bad public policy has done a couple of different things. It's imposed a war on drugs that is insanely counterproductive. And as I always say, if you weren't an economist before you were a cop, becoming a cop will make you an economist, because you see the effects of bad public policy up close and personal. You see the effects of bad public policy in terms of protracted, persistent intergenerational poverty. That is not something that would be predicted by free markets. It's something that comes from bad housing policy and bad zoning and bad schools, particularly bad welfare policy, the war on drugs. And what I would argue, layered on top of all that, the world's most oppressive criminal justice system, both in terms of prosecuting the war on drugs, as you and I have discussed in the past, the idea of civil asset forfeiture, the idea of qualified immunity that we need to get rid of, the idea that police officers are, in my view, not sufficiently held accountable, and perhaps even more importantly, police agencies are not held sufficiently accountable. Just like with schools, we need more competition at the agency level, not just at the individual officer/teacher level. There's a tremendous amount of progress that needs to be made, but there are specific things that we can do to help make progress. So, yeah, I've been around a lot of public policy, seen a lot of messed up things.
When I'm curious to your experiences as a libertarian police officer, when you talk to other police officers, what did they react to when you told them, yeah, I'm a libertarian, I'm a registered libertarian, I don't believe in enforcing, or I don't believe in the war on drugs, I think we should allow people to live their, do these things that you're arresting people for. What was their response to you, generally?
Well, the good news, by the way, is that we had a separate unit for narcotics, so I didn't have to be directly involved. But to your point, we didn't always see eye to eye. You don't always see eye to eye with your coworkers about anything, so that's not quite that big a deal. And because I wasn't a narcotics officer, you could kind of say, well, that's just Mike being Mike, and not, if you didn't agree with me, that's not going to end your day necessarily. But a number of police officers don't disagree. I think that there's a great deal of frustration because police officers, like other America, like everybody, wishes we didn't have the drug problem that we do in the United States. It's a horrible thing. It's a deadly thing. And so there is a wish that we could make a difference. If you're a police officer, I think that there's a natural tendency to want to believe that what is asked of you is the right thing.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, you want to believe in what you're doing.
Yeah. And it takes a while to realize that it doesn't work, right? That people don't avoid drugs because of the threat of going to jail. That's just not a thing.
Right.
I don't mean there is zero of that, but it's not a very effective weapon to keep people away from drugs.
Effective.
It just isn't, and cops more than most will tell you that. Personally, and I think that this goes for a number of officers, the number of people on whom I have done CPR exceeds the number of drug arrests with which I had to be involved. You are doing CPR on overdoses a lot. And I got to be honest, if a cop is doing CPR on you, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
You're probably not coming back from that.
Right.
Of all the times I've done it, I think 2 people, came back from that. And the vast majority of time, that is not a happy ending. So it's a very frustrating situation. But if you're a cop, you typically also don't have the full view of what else can be done. Right? So in that sense, I was lucky that it was my second career and that I had more of an opportunity to see that the way markets work is such that when you criminalize something that you can't stop, that the culture isn't ready to give up, you create black markets. And it's the black markets that are actually so deadly, so dangerous.
Right.
That's what's killing people with fentanyl.
Yeah.
Is that there isn't a provider you can trust. You don't know what you're taking. in too many cases, you literally don't know that you're taking any fentanyl at all. But even if you know that you're taking some, you don't know how much.
Yeah.
You just don't. You aren't given good advice about how to use it, why not to use it. It's not regulated. And by that, I don't necessarily mean regulated in the public sector. It's not even regulated by markets in the private sector, right? You don't have...
right. You don't have any testing agency or any... for legal drugs and legal... anything that you consume in your body, there are a dozen... Either it's an agency or it's a private company that's testing these things,
right,
determining what's in them. With drugs,
and you don't have any market forces driving competitors to communicate,
right,
to disclose.
Right, the opposite.
Yeah, you have quite the opposite. And that's why it's so dangerous.
Yeah.
So it is a frustrating experience. On the other hand, I would say that most officers are in favor of the idea, once it's explained to them, that bringing market forces to bear and holding officers accountable in the long run is a good thing. Even for officers, absolutely for communities.
Right.
But even for officers, in the sense that good officers ought to get paid more, mediocre ought to get paid less,
right,
crappy ones ought to get fired. Jonathan, we all know who the crappy officers are. No one's hiding the ball here.
I think the number in New York was like 2 or 3% of officers were responsible for something like 70% of lawsuits against the police department.
Absolutely.
Start there.
Start there. That's right.
It's not that hard.
And if it's 2 or 3% that are responsible for the caseload, it's probably 1%.
Right.
That's responsible for the caseload that's going to go the wrong direction on the city, that really is problematic. We know who those people are. And most officers are not willing to give up a raise for that guy.
Right. So what creates this perverse incentive? Because we see this in police unions, we see this in school teachers unions, about where there's holding, bad teachers, bad cops accountable. It is such a hard thing. Why do police unions and school teachers? Why are they so dumb? Unions, right?
Why are they so dumb?
Why can't they see what we see?
I think there's a couple different factors. The unions believe that they're doing the right thing because they represent people who have already been hired and who express their interest in terms of nothing really more than money and make my life easier. So it's the path of least resistance. And then I think you've got a couple of other factors. And by the way, you see this in all unions, not just teachers and cops, right? Those are the ones that frustrate us the most because they're in the public sector.
Sure.
Having said that, because they're in the public sector, there's a certain amount of political capture that matters a great deal. In the private sector, there's capture also in the sense that, we can shut down your company, right, if things don't go our way. So I don't mean to say this is unique in the public sector, but the idea that it's a political capture that is more important than I would have estimated before becoming a cop.
Okay.
I learned that in the town for which I worked in Broward County, the police union was the only organized political force in town.
Okay.
So for all practical purposes, the union decided who the next mayor was going to be.
Oh, wow.
Think about that.
That seems problematic.
That is problematic, right? Now, the good news is, if there's a silver lining at all, and it's not much of one, I can verify there were very thoughtful conversations about who that should be.
Okay.
But is it likely that a police union is going to pick someone not in their own interests?
Right.
That's not going to happen,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So are there cases where you get a mayor who may not be the best choice, but is the best choice for the union? That does happen.
Sure.
That does happen. So there is a certain amount of political capture. And you wish that the local political leadership would be the type that had the fortitude, the backbone, and the competence, and the political flexibility to stand up to the unions and demand what it is that he or she sees as in best alignment with the community's values.
Right.
and we should all have good food. But these things just don't tend to happen. And I can tell you from having participated, I was not a union rep, but having participated in those conversations, in the negotiations between the unions and the city in our case, the city does not ask for greater accountability, greater flexibility, the right to fire you, which is a great disappointment as a libertarian. And I can tell you that I was absolutely ready for that conversation. And the city never brought it up. Because the conversation goes something like this. I'll offer you more money, but I want greater accountability. I want the right to fire you just because I'm in a bad mood some Thursday, right?
Right.
That's the kind of accountability that any private sector company has.
Right.
And at that point, I would be able to say to the membership, let's not reject this too quick. You and I could use a few extra bucks.
Right.
Everyone here wants to work hard and be rewarded for it. I don't think we want to give that up just because we all know who needs to go. And parenthetically, let's be honest, your life as a cop is going to be better if you get rid of the 1%, the 2%.
Right.
That's true. That's absolutely true.
Every working environment has those people are a detriment to everyone else that works around them. That's every environment.
They don't always know.
Right.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But you do know. Yeah. And so I think that in the long run, I'm very optimistic. Same argument for teachers. Teachers know. Principals know. Yeah. But it's not so easy. The school boards need to demand greater accountability, and I believe that they need to be willing to pay for it. Yeah. And imagine if you ran an ad in the New York Times that said, I'm a school board in Tennessee, and I'm looking for the best and the brightest nationwide. And I'm not going to jerk around over whether I start you at $55,000 or $58,000. I'll start you at $75,000 and work you up to $1.25. Right. But here's what I want. There are a lot of people that would respond to that quite favorably.
Absolutely.
Who doesn't want to be among the best and the brightest and be rewarded for it? Yeah. Right? I believe that would be a successful recruitment campaign, but I have yet to see it in action.
I want to get into kind of a little bit more of kind of the policing work. And I know it's not directly tied to presidential, but I think it's important to kind of get an understanding of how these things work out on the ground. In Dallas, they recently created a program, and I forget the name of it, but essentially it's a social worker program where a police officer, if it's a mental health call that goes to 911, they will send out a police officer, and as soon as the police officer clears the scene, makes sure there's no danger, a social worker comes in. Right. It's actually been very effective. It's been very cost effective. It's been they've reduced the number of people they've had to go to send to hospital, which that's a huge cost because that goes to an emergency department, which then gets sent to the city. Right. And it also means that fewer police have to be on scene because it used to be that they would actually send several units to a call. And so where do you see those kind of social programs? How can we get police departments to kind of understand that that's an aid to them? It keeps them focused on the things that they should be focused on. How do we start to communicate those things? It can work. It doesn't always work. Sure. You don't want them to get sent to every call. You don't want if somebody's got a gun, don't send a social worker to it, right? It's bigger than that. Yeah. You cannot send a social worker to any call. Right. Full stop. You cannot send a social worker to any call. Let that sink in. Okay. If the call comes in, I'm having a problem finding my cat. Right. You cannot send a social worker. You have to send a police officer because you don't know what you're going to find once you arrive. Fair enough. Somebody might call, we've heard those stories of somebody calling in, trying to order a pizza, and then the operator realizes they're actually asking for help. So you're right. Well, yes. You don't know what they're actually calling about. But people don't communicate on 911 very effectively. Sure. What they fail to mention is I'm having trouble finding my cat because my ex took it. And he's hiding in the backyard and he's got a gun. Right. Maybe I didn't know he has a gun. Maybe you get where I'm going. Yeah. You cannot send a social worker on a call. What you can do is, as you described, send a social worker to follow up. Right.
that can be a big advantage. It is not cheap.
Sure.
Yes, if you take into consideration all of the costs, the hospitalization that you might be able to avoid, because a police officer is a fairly blunt instrument.
Right.
You only have a certain number of tools. I can take you to jail. I can walk away. I can take you to the hospital.
Right.
But if I'm not comfortable walking away, you're going somewhere.
Right.
What do I got here? So if it's another tool in the tool belt that's cheaper than I gotta, take this person somewhere, then that's all good.
Right.
And if you can resolve something in a way, or at least take the steps toward resolving something in a way that precludes further calls,
right.
Now you've enhanced safety, well-being, and reduced costs. So it can work. But bear in mind that it's expensive to start. And I think this is the hurdle that some communities have a hard time overcoming. Right. That's a hard conversation, in answer to your question, because you've got to say, in the long run, you're going to be better off and you're probably going to save a few bucks. But it's going to take an initial investment.
Right.
Because you can't cut down the number of cops. Because you're responding to the same number of calls. And you're going to have to hire a couple of social workers.
Right.
Well, you know how budgeting works. That can be a challenge. It can work, but it takes a fairly broad view of the problem. And back to our local political leadership problem, that could be a real challenge.
For sure. So you ran for Congress in 2018?
2020. Well, it was a 2019 campaign. January of 2020 special election.
Right.
Very strange circumstance in one of the 5 bluest districts in the United States.
What did you learn to do, to not do, and what do you think you can carry with it into this campaign?
You do learn that the value of the Libertarian Party brand is not what you thought it was.
Okay.
You do learn that you wish the presidential campaign had done more to brand the party. You do learn that people are open to your message. You do learn that it's not everybody. When I say that most Americans have a libertarian streak, in some Americans it's not large.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and they don't know that's the word for it.
They certainly don't know that. But there are a certain number of Americans that are going to be hard to reach, and that we need to get comfortable with the idea that we're not going after everybody.
Right.
Which speaks to your earlier question about messaging. We're not messaging to 100% of the population. Remember that in a 3-way race, 37% wins.
Right.
I recognize that mathematically 34% could win. 37% does win.
Right.
Okay? So even pie in the sky shooting the lights out, you're only looking for 37% of the vote.
Right.
And that doesn't mean 37% of the electorate. That means 37% of the vote, which is even smaller. So we need to get off of this idea that you need to water down your messaging to reach 80% or 70%, 50%. No, you don't.
Right. You
need to reach like 20%. Because when you take into consideration, you're going to be motivating people who haven't voted in the past. That there is a target out there for us and that we need to go after it hard. A lot of that is independence, but not all of our target are independents. We can win over Democrats. We can win over Republicans. Back to the idea that those parties have misaligned with the values of their underlying constituents. And we recognize that a number of Democratic voters vote for no other reason than to keep a Republican out and vice versa.
For sure.
I get that. I don't want Joe Biden to win either. So if I were a Republican, I get why I would vote for Republican and vice versa. Nobody thinks that Donald Trump being president of the United States is a good idea. I think most of us viewed that as kind of a weird phenomenon when it happened the first time around.
Right.
Which it brings me to another observation, speaking of running for office on the local level. Weird things happen. If there's anything that being 62 as I am, rather than 26 as I used to be last week, teaches you, it is that weird things happen. If there's only one lesson I would pass on to my approximately 30-year-old children, it is that. weird things happen.
Right.
For better or for worse,
Right.
there's some weird stuff out there. Consider the 2024 presidential election race. If Donald Trump becomes president again, I'm sorry, that's a weird thing. That is a strange thing. It was strange the first time.
Right.
I would argue it's even stranger the second time.
Sure.
Under indictment several times. They don't really impress me as being all that important. I think it's true that they're politically motivated. On the other hand, one thing that really bothers me about Donald Trump is having found by a jury to be civilly liable for a sexual assault.
Right.
That bothers me a lot more, to be honest.
A decade ago, that would have completely disqualified him from being the Republican candidate, period.
And I hope a decade from now it does.
Should, yes, absolutely.
That bothers me a lot more than waving around documents,
Right.
for example, which is dumb.
Sure.
But that's a different... dumb is different.
You can kind of laugh that part off, but you can't laugh off something like this.
Like a sexual assault. No, it bothers me at a much more profound level. Having said that, Joe Biden becoming president again, you have to admit that's a weird thing. Joe Biden becoming president the first time was a bit of an odd thing.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember Joe Biden being in his 40s. He wasn't particularly bright then. He was not an ethical guy. He was not a principled guy. Him becoming president the first time is a bit of an odd thing.
Right.
But being several years past his sell-by date, I think...
Couple?
Several.
Many.
You know, I have a whole head of gray hair. And he's like my mom's age.
I was going to talk to you about that because...
I consider myself mature. And he's a generation ahead of me.
Right.
That's an odd thing. That's an odd thing. So, having said that, would it be weird for a libertarian to take a real competitive run in this race? Sure, that would be an oddity. But don't tell me it's all that much more odd than not.
Right.
Right? Something strange is going to happen. I can guarantee you that.
For sure.
Something strange is going to happen.
You say that Biden, it's strange that he won and strange that Trump won. In my opinion, it looks like Trump only won because he ran against Hillary and Biden only won because he ran against Trump. Maybe the guy who runs against both of them will be the one to win.
There you go.
You mentioned your age, 62, which is, like you said, a generation younger than Trump or Biden. If a voter is looking at your campaign, what would you say to somebody who says, "Well, I want somebody young to speak. I want somebody who to really contrast their age"? What would you say to that voter?
Then you should support our campaign. I am younger, and my age contrasts with the competition. You can't have both a certain amount of experience. You can't have 40 years of professional experience and not be 62.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Nor can I apologize for not having 60 years of experience and still being a generation younger than those idiots.
Right.
So I think I'm in the sweet spot. Let's put it that way.
There you go. The Libertarian Party is kind of in a bit of a divisive state right now, which is we're libertarian. We're always probably in a divisive state. If we really think about it, we're always in that place.
That's right. That's well said. I'm sorry, but that is well said.
So what would you do? What would your campaign do to get libertarians who say, let's say they support a different candidate, they disagree with some of the things that the way you're presenting yourself, your messaging. We all have different opinions on how campaigns should be messaged. Libertarians always have different opinions. Let's be honest. So how would you go? How would you reach out to people who disagree with you now? And let's say you did win the nomination. How would you bring them in? How would you say, hey, here's why you should support me?
I think that they will come in before the nomination actually happens. I'm very optimistic. And that comes from not only the style of campaign that we're running, but it comes from direct observation. The people that are coming into our campaign come from all over the party. For example, we have people that are on our professional staff that are members of your caucus, We have a lot of people who are members of the Mises Caucus. We have a lot of people who are not members of any caucus. We have volunteers that come from each one of those different groups. And every time I meet with a county, every time I meet with a state convention, I see that same phenomenon playing out. There are people who are warm to our message who don't have a lot in common other than the fact that they're members of the Libertarian Party. Having said that, to your point about disagreement, there are people who disagree with our campaign from time to time who also come from different parts of the party. In other words, I would be lying to you if I said most of the people who disagree with us are from one particular part of the party. It's not that easy. I almost wish that were the case, because then you would know like where you should be looking, what you should be doing differently. But I don't find that there's a typical underlying theme that comes from one piece of the party or another. To your point, unifying the party, unifying any group of people, takes a couple of basic ingredients. I've spent a lot of time in my first career consulting with nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations. And one of the things that you find particularly problematic with nonprofits is the absence of a unifying goal.
Right.
When you present a goal that everyone can rally around and present it in a way that is both appealing and doable, but a stretch, right? It can't be succeeding in ordering pizza this afternoon.
Right.
But a goal of actually interrupting the political duopoly, actually changing the way that American politics works, actually forcing the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to take into consideration our views going forward in the future, forcing the media to recognize us as a force to be reckoned with. Those form a goal that everyone can rally around. This is absolutely critical. And it is not contingent on what part of the party you come from. That's important. The other thing that's important is to recognize that different parts of our party, at a very granular level, different individuals in our party, have different concerns, different motivations, different objectives, different worries, different things they're pissed off about.
Sure.
And legitimately, for cause, not just because they woke up on the wrong side of the bed.
Right.
So, for example, a lot of people in our party are still pissed off about past presidential elections. By the way, I put myself in this category. And I think that, for example, the Mises Caucus got a lot of motivation, a lot of momentum from that phenomenon.
Right.
It's why I joined the Mises Caucus years ago. It's the reason I put money into the Mises Caucus. It's the reason I took the caucus, and still do, take the caucus extremely seriously. It's the reason why when I see the caucus do something that I'm not 100% on board with, I get pissed because I feel like it's my caucus, right? And anyone in the Mises leadership knows, because we've had those discussions and arguments and disagreements. And so I recognize that that is something that appeals to a lot of people throughout the party. Not everybody.
Sure.
Not everybody in the Mises Caucus. Not everybody outside of the Mises Caucus. But that is a legitimate concern and a problem. And that's only one example. That there are plenty of others. And sometimes it cuts by issues, right? Immigration is an example of an issue that splits our party a little bit in subtle ways sometimes in not so subtle ways. That doesn't necessarily cut by caucus, but it requires, I believe, a candidate who appreciates why it is you're pissed about what it is you're pissed about. We're not in the business of blowing off members of our party just because we might see things slightly differently. Again, we're not Democrats.
Right.
We argue, we punch each other in the face, we have a beer.
Right.
We don't ostracize each other or pretend like well, because we disagree, one of us now needs to be an outsider. That's not how this works. Right? I'm old enough to remember Ronald Reagan. Ask your parents. Reagan was the guy who said, if the two of us agree on everything, one of us doesn't need to be here. And he's also the guy who said, never speak ill of another Republican. He's the guy who believed in a big tent Republican Party, which today sounds a little bit strange.
Right.
All of those things are not incompatible. And I think that at bedrock level, members of the Libertarian Party agree with all of that too. It's just that we believe earnestly in our right to argue with each other. And I think that that's just fine.
One of the things I've always appreciated about the Libertarian Party, and that I've seen that Republicans and Democratic parties really have kind of fallen off of, 10 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, you used to have pro-choice Republicans. You used to have pro-life Democrats. They don't exist.
They don't exist anymore.
And
you think the way you're supposed to think.
Exactly, and I think that is something.
Or there's the door.
Right, and that's why I worry about the Libertarian Party, is if we ever get into that mode of if you don't agree with exactly these things, you can't be in the party. I think that's a dangerous thing.
Now, it's a very dangerous thing.
We should obviously be speaking our principles and let the market forces decide on what exactly the exact platform plank should be. But that doesn't mean we should just have sign on to this and you're in or you're out, right?
That's right. Indeed, I think we should be in the mode of taking your $25, even if you disagreed with us about everything.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
If your money is green, you're in.
Right. Exactly.
That doesn't mean that we want to nominate you to represent us.
Preferably Bitcoin, but dollars will be okay. Yes. Exactly. Okay. So let's go into specific policies. Let's talk about a few different. I'll throw out a topic, and you kind of tell me, okay, what do you do on day one? What do you do after a year? Where do you hope they would be after 4 years, right?
Sure.
So let's. You mentioned immigration. What would you do day one, year two, year four? What would you on that specific topic?
Sure. Let me work backwards.
Okay.
Because the first thing you have to do is articulate where you're going in the long run.
Okay, go for it.
Otherwise, people won't go along with you.
Right.
Otherwise, you shock them on day one if they don't see where you're going. In the long run, we need a much more pro-immigration policy. We also need, in my view, a much more pro-immigrant policy. Those are two slightly different things. Having spent some time at the border in Arizona, I learned that the humanitarian crisis down there is profound. Mm-hmm. And I would argue as fundamental a problem as any other aspect of immigration. So, not a big believer in surging federal resources anywhere. I don't think I'm going to get any pushback on that statement from anybody in our party. But if there is some place where we need to do a better job, it is vetting people through in a legal fashion. Culturally speaking, the American public is not in a place where we're going to throw open the border and give up the idea of vetting people through. People want a vetting process. And I'm sensitive to that argument. I appreciate that. So, having said that, let me remind Republicans, when I worked for the White House, we could vet someone in 90 minutes. This, to your earlier point of presuming someone innocent,
right.
This idea that it should take days and weeks and months and years to vet someone through is bullshit.
Yeah.
It just is. Let's call it what it is. It's just silly talk.
Right.
We need the resources to vet people through in a timely fashion. And at the same time, we need to take away the incentive to come through illegally. Because the indentured servitude that goes on, most people come through illegally. Most of the people who come through illegally come through using a contractor.
Yeah.
The contractor, a coyote, contractor hands you over to another contractor using an app on the phone. There's no personal relationship on the other side of the border to an American contractor. And most of those contractors are affiliated with someone who is likely to bring you into a life of indentured servitude. Right. This is what we must stop. So, we need better resources to vet people through legally. We need better resources to stop illegal immigration. I'm not opposed to using the word wall. call it a fence, call it a wall, call it electronics, call it humans. Right now, the border is wide open. I've been to the end of the border. I've seen where it stops. Then there's some lawn, and then there's a hill on the other side of which you cannot see. That's an open border. That's the definition of an open border.
Right.
Nobody wants that. It's a humanitarian crisis, and it's a political crisis at the same time. So we need to cut that out, bring people through legally. So I would surge resources to do that. By the way, we need to cut back on the resources in the Defense Department in every single aspect.
Well, then let's go there then. My next topic.
We can train Army officers to adjudicate people being vet through. It's not brain surgery. Right. Okay? Right. So the resources are there. Yes, we need to cut back on the Defense Department. What were you thinking in particular?
Just America's role in the world. Hamas just recently attacked Israel. Israel's attacking Gaza. Obviously, the war in Ukraine. Day one, year 2, year 4. What's your?
Let's start with the easier ones first, and there are no easy ones. So, shut my mouth for using the word easy, right? But let's work up to the most difficult. Day one, you've got to start making phone calls to leaders around the world that there's a new attitude in town. If you are a European leader who has grown accustomed to America being your plan A, this is your 18-month heads up that we are exiting NATO. Mm-hmm. If you want to remain paranoid of a Russian invasion, you do you. I'm not arguing that you should be or shouldn't be. I am personally persuaded by Russia's inability to overrun Ukraine, right, that you probably don't have as much to fear as you would have thought 2 years ago, but you do you. Right. If you believe that you need 3.5% of your GDP to protect yourself, you better start spending it because you're not going to get it from the United States anymore. I think that is a difficult conversation, but to be honest, strategically the easiest in the bucket that we need to discuss. Right. Similarly, if you have made an investment in Taiwan because you believe that you need to be in a place where the United States will back you up in a conflict with the People's Republic, come hell or high water, this is your heads up that that's a bad idea. If you need to be in a place protected by the United States government Department of Defense, can I interest you in Minneapolis? Because that is a place that we would back up come hell or high water. Right? If that's the keystone to you deciding where you want to make an investment, then you better consider something that we would actually protect. We have gotten ourselves into this situation where we have almost a self-fulfilling prophecy where we have induced people to make these investments, not just in technology, but mostly in technology, not just in chips, mostly in chips, and now, even more important strategically, the high-end nature of chips that we believe that we need to power artificial intelligence. Now we believe that these have become such an important component to our economy that we need to back up Taiwan. And I think that we need to unwind that. The idea that ambiguity in any relationship is a good idea, much less strategic ambiguity in an international diplomatic sense is a good idea. That's just a bad idea. That's just a bad idea. We need clarity. And to be clear, Taiwan need not be in our national interest. Ukraine, we should not be providing further funding to Ukraine. That's the truth of the matter is. And I know that that's a heartbreaking thing for a lot of people to hear. But Ukraine is not squarely in our national interest. It was not before, and it is not now. Now that we're into it, I wish that we weren't into it. But at this point, we are. Right. We are waging a proxy war with Russia. on day one, you start bringing pressure to bear on both sides. With one side, with the threat that we're going to put in more resources, with the other side that we're going to put in less. This is your 18-month heads up. Start negotiating.
Okay.
And then we need to be out of there. We need to be out of there. The one that we need to spend time talking about is Israel, obviously. And it should almost go without saying, we are all heartbroken by what we have seen in the attacks by Hamas. Horrible. And the brutality, the insensitivity is something that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, much less a people with whom we have had such close relations since the inception of the nation of Israel. Familial relationships, personal relationships, professional relationships, commercial relationships, and of course diplomatic relationships. It's moving, and now we all expect a huge counteroffensive by the Israeli Defense Forces. We support the right of Israel to defend itself. Part of national defense is sending the signal that if you attack our people, we will counterattack in a way that will discourage you and anyone else from even considering anything like this in the future. That is a part of national defense, and it has to be. Over 1,200 people were killed in Israel in those first couple of days. That is not a number that's completely dissimilar from what happened on 9/11 in the United States when over 2,900 people were killed. And we remember the United States, we remember what it felt like. We remember that on an emotional level. We also remember what the United States government did. The United States government decided to use that as a pretense, not merely to go after those responsible, not merely to go after those who harbored those who were responsible, but to invade and overthrow the government of Afghanistan, to invade and overthrow the government of Iraq. And I don't think anyone at this point, or even too many people in those days, argued that the government of Iraq had anything to do with it. The number of lives lost in those invasions, in those occupations, hundreds of thousands of each, over 1 million lives lost. Those actions, I believe, embarrass the American people. They do not align with our values. Nor, importantly, do they align with our national interest. They undermine our interest in a foreign relations sense. They undermine our interest in terms of economic development. They undermine our interest in terms of democratic development. Ironically, because that was part of the assertion, right? And that did not come to fruition. We need to learn that in a strategic sense, we're not good at this. We're very good on a tactical level. We're good at death and destruction. We're good at moving material. We're good at taking land and holding it. We're good at opening and protecting sea lanes. We're even good at toppling governments if you don't mind the secrets coming out.
Right.
But in a long-term strategic sense, in terms of achieving something that the American public would say was a good idea, we're just not good at that.
No.
And I want the Israeli government to learn from our mistakes.
Yeah.
Because they are legion. And we worry. I think anyone who says that they're not worried about the next couple of weeks, the next couple of years, I think that they're either lying to you or has their head in the sand. There is a great deal to worry about here. Okay. We all want, as we want for everybody in the world, we want maximum political agency for the Palestinian people. What that looks like is one thing. How to get there
Right.
is hard. No one should be using the word easy here, right? That is hard. And I would urge the people, the players involved, the Israelis, the U.S. government, to do even more than we have in the past. I would urge the leadership of fill in the blank, the PLO, Hezbollah, Hamas, to do even more than they have in the past in the right direction. But I think it's important, by the way, the governments of Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon have not nearly done the lifting that they should have been doing.
They've openly rejected the Palestinian people from moving there, so.
Or helping in a material way.
Yeah.
No, there's plenty of disappointment to go around here. Plenty of disappointment to go around.
There's blame on Israel. There's blame on all the other countries around them. There's blame on...
Absolutely. It's frustrating. Having said that, let's be wide-eyed about what's going on here. In my view, Hamas is being played by the Iranian government.
Yeah.
It may be that the leadership of Hamas believes that what they have done will advance the cause of their political agency in the long run. I can't get in their heads. I think we would all agree that inside of their headspace is a weird thing to even consider on a day like today. But whether they believe that they are helping their cause in the long run or not, they're not. They may have been duped into believing that, but it is not true. What I believe is true is that the Iranian government, which has provided to Hamas money, armament, intelligence, motivation, the Iranian government has played them because their interests are driving a wedge between Israel and the rest of the region. The Iranian government is all about the projection of their own military hegemony in the Middle East region. That's what this is all about. And we all remember the hard work. You got to give credit where it's due. The Trump administration made a big contribution to lasting relationships in the region, pushing the accords between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. And that runs counter to Iranian hegemonic interests.
Right.
And it is going to be very difficult for leadership like that in Saudi Arabia to hang in there with Israel as we go through what we're about to see in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I think that things are going very well for the Iranian strategy. I think it's disgusting.
Right.
But that's what I see playing out here. And the Iranians are praying, probably literally praying for an overreaction from the Israeli Defense Forces.
They want to see Israel have that overreaction, and all the countries around Israel react to that.
And what we've seen is so disgusting. It's hard to imagine what we would characterize as an overreaction, right? I mean, emotionally speaking, there's almost nothing you would call an overreaction.
Right. Before I was a libertarian, when 9/11 happened, I think I was 14 or 15. I was, kill everything and anything that stands in our way. It doesn't matter.
And
I had that visceral reaction. There's a sense of justice that we feel, and we have to temper that, right? We have to be careful not to succumb to these passionate, we want justice seen, and we have to understand that the child whose home you just bombed in retaliation to strike at the military
just as innocent.
Is just as innocent. So it's a brutal image to watch, and we hope and pray that our children never have to experience anything like it.
I hope we never have to see it again, much less experience
it. Right.
I don't expect that's the case, though.
Right. So let's say you're president. Taiwan does get invaded. What do you do?
Nothing.
I think Biden is sending resources to aid to Gaza to help evacuate some people. Is that something you would consider?
Yes.
Taiwan, really anywhere, would you consider using those resources to evacuate people from an area that was being invaded?
I would use resources to evacuate any place in the world, whether they were at war or not.
Okay. That makes sense.
I would be glad to import the entire nation of Cuba.
Right. That makes sense to me. One thing that most people don't realize about the refugee program is that refugees actually pay back the money that is spent on bringing them to the United States, which is kind of an interesting...
Immigration is good for the United States.
Exactly.
Financially, economically, culturally.
Absolutely. Okay, let's... it's kind of hard. That's such a dark topic we just got on.
It's horrible.
War on drugs. Again, day 1, day 2, year 4.
Again, you've got to send the signal where this is going. That people deserve bodily autonomy. It is a right given to us by a higher authority than the Constitution of the United States. That's where this is headed. Completely. We need to wrap up, finalize the piece of this that is cannabis. We're not done with that. A lot of people think that we are. We are not done with that. Which is a weird thing.
Right.
Which is a weird thing.
It's so ubiquitous. It is really still wild. There was I think it was in Michigan. The court just ruled that a cop smelling marijuana is no longer reasonable suspicion for a search because it's legal almost in half the states. So it's no longer. It's like finally, at least that
right. These steps seem so small, don't they?
I know.
They seem like baby steps, and there's 1,000 of them, and we still have 496 to go.
Right.
So. There is a great deal that a president can do, both in terms of leading that conversation as well as at the federal level moving legislation. But the first thing that you've got to do is sunset the marijuana piece. Contemporaneously, you can start moving the piece that relates to non-addictive drugs. I think the American public is much more ready to receive a message that we should be ending the war on drugs that are not addictive. I think for the American public, there is a bright line distinction there to be made. And so politically speaking, that's the next battle. That's the next hill worth dying on. And then finally, once people become comfortable with that and see that not only was the war on drugs not successful, but that we can better handle the medical problems that drugs represent out of a prosecutorial context, then people will be ready to go for full bodily autonomy. What that timeline looks like is not clear. The marijuana timeline was longer than what I thought it would be. And obviously longer than what we hoped.
Right, and the president can't just snap his fingers and make legislation disappear. That's not.
No, but
how it works.
No, but you can change enforcement.
Sure.
You can wield a great deal of influence over the Department of Justice.
Right.
And that matters.
Yeah.
And that matters. So there are things that you can do in that regard, but state legislatures are going to have to move. The federal government moving in advance rather than being the slowest to move, which is what we've seen recently, I think makes a big difference. So that conversation, I believe, can actually bear fruit. I think that can move more quickly than the marijuana piece moved with regard to non-addictive drugs. I would be optimistic that during the first term of a libertarian administration, you could make a lot of headway beyond marijuana. And once the American public sees the success of that, and by the way, having been told the entire time where we're going, that I think that people will be open to the idea of full bodily autonomy at some point.
I'll give you a really easy topic and then a really hard one. First one, the Fed. What do?
You end the Fed. Again, you let people know where we're going in the long run and why. We're getting rid of the Federal Reserve lock, stock, and barrel in the long run. And the reason that we're doing that is because we need a better monetary policy. It's not that we need no monetary policy. It's that we need a better one. We need a rules-based system. And this isn't out of anger so much. This isn't vengeance, right? This isn't retribution. This is a practical recognition that the Fed just simply, best efforts notwithstanding, can't live up to the mandate that we have given it. That research has shown that a rules-based system can actually perform better in terms of dampening the boom-bust cycle. And that's what this needs to all be about. Now, how you do that, you appoint Fed leadership. Remember, the White House appoints Fed leadership. Fed leadership that believes in a rules-based system, and there are plenty of people out there. So that's not hard. It's not as hard as some other things. Nothing is easy, but that's not the hardest piece. So that can be undertaken. You need to make regulation of the financial services industries completely optional, starting with the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. They're largely optional now, but they have to be completely optional. Indeed, we would want an option for a nationally chartered bank to go with no regulation at all, to be able to engage a private sector firm to give a heavy audit, for example. And I don't know how many banks would opt out of federal regulation, but a lot do opt into now a state charter and state regulation. So the reason you do that is because you need to winnow down the political leverage that the Fed has. Anybody who's been around Washington knows that you can move legislation against an agency only after you winnow down their political power.
Right.
So you got to replace their leadership, take away their regulatory stranglehold over financial institutions, which is where a lot of their power comes from. Then you can transfer their balance sheet to the Treasury Department, make it subject to legislation, and the midnight bailouts. Not a silver bullet. I recognize the legislature can do plenty of stupid things. They have proven that they can, but at least it would be harder than this, the Fed chairman decides on a Tuesday and by Wednesday morning it happens, which is the system that we have now. Once you've accomplished those three things, you can move legislation to end the Fed completely. And remember why this is important. It's not just a matter of replacing the willy-nilly monetary policy, which is critical. And you don't have to move all the way back to a gold standard to do it. You can go to a Milton Friedman style control mechanism, controlling the monetary base, how much money has been issued, and do that off of a laptop without locking 18 people in a room every 6 weeks and just have them put their finger in the air and figure out where this should be going. It would be a much preferable system and would boost economic
development. So ChatGPT for Fed chair is what you're saying.
As long as it's tied to the right laptop, we can let ChatGPT deliver the news, right?
There we go.
But the other thing that's really important is we need the Fed to get out of a number of markets, most especially the idea of issuing its own cryptocurrency. No one believes that the Fed would either create a level playing field for completely fair competition with Bitcoin and Ethereum and others, which is completely critical. Yeah. We don't know how these markets are going to develop, but we do know that we need these markets to develop in a way that allows the best player to win.
Yeah.
And the Fed would obviously advantage its own product.
Right.
You can't have it. And of course, the other problem that maybe only libertarians are aware of at the moment, but other Americans are increasingly aware, is the Fed would have access not only to metadata, but all data regarding transactions. Right. And no one believes that the Fed would be unwilling to hand that over to the Treasury Department or the Justice Department or anybody else.
Right.
You can't have it.
No.
You just can't have it. And so this is a very important battle. And the reason it needs to be engaged is not because it's easy. It's not because everyone already understands it and there's already a political bandwagon, but it is critical to the future of the economic development of the United States. This is the reason why Ron Paul engaged it. Not because it was easy, not because everyone was already behind the idea, right? But because it is critical.
CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, are really, you talk about handing all of your information. Think about what you can learn from somebody by looking at all of their transactions. And think about that's what government would have on everyone.
That's right.
So
imagine if people found out how boring I really am.
Right.
It would undermine my whole campaign.
Right, exactly. So this is I gave you the easy one, now here's the hard one. Abortion. Obviously, Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Which was the correct decision?
Handing it back to the states.
Handing it back to the states was however you feel about abortion.
Right. I agreed with the decision. Would you make any moves? Do you think that there is any place for the federal government to come in and say, okay, you shouldn't So there's no place at all for any abortion legislation, either in terms of saying, okay, up to a certain age, or
I see where you're going.
Or there's, for example, in Texas, several counties have made it illegal for you to take a woman to seek an abortion in another state, to travel through their county to go seek an abortion. Do you feel like there's any role for either a constitutional amendment on this issue? I'm leaving it wide open there for you to...
I appreciate that. No, there really isn't a role for the federal government. In theory, there could be. The only reason any of us believe that a more muscular federal government would be a good idea is in protecting our individual liberties. And there are cases where we see really wacky local laws that we believe violate the U.S. Constitution, but they also violate the Texas Constitution.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I believe that inviting the federal government in, even to play a more muscular role in protecting our individual liberties, is fraught with hazard. And so in that sense, I would keep the federal government out of it completely. Certainly in a legislative sense. I think we all agree. And in a regulatory sense. The only sliver of light I'll leave open is the possibility of standing in for your liberty where there is clearly a law that violates the U.S. Constitution and the state authority is just not doing anything about it. I don't mean that can't happen in theory, because it can. But again, I'm skeptical about inviting the federal government in because, as we have seen, best intentions notwithstanding, that can lead to some pretty wacky consequences.
For sure.
At the state level, back to our discussion about black markets. In terms of immigration. When the government makes something illegal that the culture is not ready to give up and that the government cannot stop, you create a black market. Right. That's what is so dangerous. Black markets kill. Yeah. Black markets kill. It's important, I believe. Look, I was raised by a Lutheran and by a Calvinist. I'm not going to be able to hide the ball in terms of how I might feel about abortion personally. I'm not going to try to hide the ball in that regard. But that has to be irrelevant. It's important for people, like in my family, to understand that public policy has to always remain downstream from culture. That when you criminalize something, even if you make a rule against it, but certainly if you criminalize something and create a black market in it, when you try to affect culture using public policy, you're going upstream in a way that is not going to be successful in the long run. It's going to create black markets. It's going to create a political backlash. It's not going to win the argument that you want to win. I tell my family all the time, this debate that you want to have about abortion has to happen at the cultural level. That is not a public policy debate that you are going to win. Right. Not going to happen. As a matter of public policy, where the culture is in every state. We are not going to tolerate either ends of the spectrum. Every state is going to have to draw a line in gestational time. This is a very difficult... This is a cringeworthy topic. Yeah, this is a very cringeworthy topic. And you're right, none of us are qualified to answer it. But every state legislature is going to have to draw a line in gestational time because the culture is not going to tolerate... conception or birth. Have an abortion until 5 minutes before delivery. Just not going to tolerate that. To which we're sensitive. I mean, I get that, right? Yeah, absolutely. Nor is our culture at the opposite end of the scale saying we're gonna criminalize this 5 minutes after conception. Right.
Ban birth control, for example,
right,
of any kind.
Right. That is not going to happen. So each state legislature is going to have to draw a line. Right. There's just no getting around it. As much as my fellow Lutherans and Calvinists may wish over here, some Democrats, which honestly, I got to be honest, I find a little bit strange as well, Over here, it's just not reality. You're going to have to draw a line.
So to kind of clarify and kind of roll back to my beginning is that you would neither pro-life or pro-choice legislation from the federal level, you would just oppose both in general.
At the federal level, absolutely. I would support the idea of, technically speaking, it's a pro-choice position for the states, right? They're going to have to draw a line.
Right.
There's going to have to be choice on one side of the line and only life as an option on the other side of the line.
Right.
Whether you call that a pro-choice or pro-life position, that says more about you than it does about the line itself.
One of the best things that the pro-life movement did, and frankly, one of, in my opinion, one of the worst things, the best for them, the worst for everybody else, is that they defined everything by extremely stringent. Pro-life means until birth, and that has really kind of twisted our discourse on some of this. And I think it kind of speaks to generally how, we talked about Republicans, used to have some pro-choice, Democrats used to have some pro-life. I think it's really helped, this political division in this country as being black and white. Everything has to be black and white. And guys, this is the real world. There are gray areas that we simply don't have the real answers to. We don't know what the best policy choice is for a particular issue.
And it has to follow our values, and different communities, different individuals have different values, and that's reflected at the state level to a certain extent still. And each state is mixed, and they're going to have to fight it out. I don't have a way of letting you off the hook for that. If you're a state legislature, you're just going to have to figure that out. Now, having said that, I do believe in the fullness of time. And I don't know what I mean by that. I don't know whether it's, 30 years or 300 years. It's not 30 months.
Right.
But in the fullness of time, I do believe that abortion will be one of those things that's in the rearview mirror. I do believe that is true. Both because of where I believe our culture is going to be going and in terms of where technologies are going. I believe that at some point in the future, you will have to explain what abortion was.
Right. I'm hopeful that technology will get to the point of where we don't even need to ask that question anymore. But I do think that you're right in that in over the next whatever amount of time is, you'll see that people who have always described themselves as pro-life, well, they'll read a story about an 11-year-old girl who gets impregnated, or you read about a mother who dies because an emergency abortion wasn't able to be performed. Or you'll read about these stories and they'll realize that life is very nuanced and complicated and that there are always exceptions. And so hopefully, like you said, that this, and I agree with the overturning Roe v. Wade, even though it sounds like I'm probably a little bit more on the pro-choice side of things than you, I think that I hope that balance starts to be found. And we'll have states go really strong one way and strong states go really strong the other way. But hopefully over time, that policy kind of comes to meet our cultural and then at the point where we, it starts matching that culture, we can say, okay, now we can start influencing culture. Because as we've seen, when we've put it to the federal government, it became such a hardline issue that it's really caused, my parents would vote Republican only because they were pro-life.
Yeah, no, I get that.
And that was
my family
and that
too.
was the thing. It was and so it's going to be very interesting how that shapes the Republican Party and the Democrats, but how that shapes our politics coming up over the next.
It is very interesting, and I also think it's an opportunity for the Libertarian Party because I think that there are people who feel trapped in each one of those parties.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And are looking for some other way to go.
Right. So we're in Dallas. For those who don't know, we were in a hotel about 5 minutes from my house.
In Plano.
You asked if we could if it would be okay to record at my house, but my kids are out of school this week. They've got fall break. We're going to go to the state fair tomorrow.
Excellent, good for you.
And
so I remember those days. Having raised two myself, I remember those days.
As I told you, there was no way they were going to be quiet. Hopefully, the air conditioning wasn't too loud, and there was somebody cleaning next room. Hopefully, it was quiet enough on here. So you've got a busy schedule. Where were you the past couple days, and where are you going from here?
Dallas. Before this, I've got Brazos, Harris County, McLennan, Collin County. All on the docket. I was in Travis County day before yesterday. We have a total of 9 events in 6 days. This is our second trip to Texas. It will not be our last trip to Texas during this campaign. I do believe that this is the right way to campaign. Not only in terms of effectiveness, but just as importantly, this is how I learn. And to be honest, it's what I enjoy. I do not find social media to be an accurate reflection of reality.
No, I've often said that humans, we've adapted to in-person communication. Then we came along the telephone, and we kind of started to adapt to that. And then social media came along, and we're just like, no,
we suck at it.
All out the window. Exactly.
We suck at it.
Exactly.
Maybe we'll get better in the future.
We kind of need to. I'll tell you that. I'll say that.
We engage. Obviously, everyone knows that we engage in social media, and we've got 2 different websites, and we're fully engaged in Facebook and Instagram. I don't mean that we poo-poo it and we don't do it.
You have to.
But politics is about people.
Politics is local, and frankly, if you're not out meeting people, you're not doing politics.
I agree with that.
That's really what it has to be, because people can read your social media stuff and like it or don't like it, but until you actually meet them and get in front of them, whether that's in person or even on a television, that's better than nothing. Having those conversations is going to be really important. And I do think your campaign has done a really good job of getting out there. I've seen you at a bunch of events all over the country, and I think that is really important. And that is, like you said, the right way.
And it's more fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's more fun. We'll be in Florida, home for a few days. Right now, this is a 14-day stretch during which I'm only home 2 days.
Okay.
Busy. Was in Florida for several days. Home for a day, North Carolina. Home for a day, Texas. Home for several days, and then thank God my wife Nancy is coming with me to Florida for several days after that. So we'll be in Jacksonville and Melbourne and Tampa. Awesome. And Broward County. Fundraising event for Josh Lavka, which is very important to us. He's a good buddy of ours for a long time. He helped me out on the congressional campaign. And he is now running for the State House. And so we have a fundraiser for him on the 22nd. On the 22nd, I want everyone to be there for the Josh Lavka fundraiser.
Awesome. That sounds good. You had mentioned the goldnewdeal.com.
Goldnewdeal.org.
It's
okay if you go to .com, because recently someone in our campaign made the announcement that you can go to goldnewdeal.com and find it. At which point we all panicked and went out and got goldnewdeal.com, which now points to goldnewdeal.org.
I was going to say, you might want to do that.
Yes.
That is a good idea.
And for those who can spell my last name, which is not everybody, you can go to MikeTremont.com.
It'll be in the title. There's 2 A's in Tremont. It's easy to remember goldnewdeal.org. And then you can link to MikeTremont.com. They're 2 very different websites. One's more about the campaign, and one's more about the platform itself. So it's a very fun way. I got to be honest. This may not be something that my campaign team would want me to say. The MikeTremont.com website is actually more interesting than I am. Okay.
It's less boring than I am.
You know what,
so
though?
Don't be dissuaded from going to the website just because I'm boring personally.
There you go. Awesome. Well, thank you for sitting down.
Thank
this was
you,
a great idea.
Jonathan.
This was I enjoyed talking, and I think it's always better to have in-person talks, and I'm sure when you come back to Texas, we'll do it again.
That would be great. You're a lot of fun. Good luck with all of your projects as well. I admire everything that you do. Even when you and I disagree, I admire all of your hard work.
It's work. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to be with you.